September 12, 1942. Guadalcanal, 9:30 p.m. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt, Red Mike. Edson stands in total darkness on a ridge 1 mile south of Henderson Field. Below him, hidden in the black wall of jungle, 3 Japanese soldiers are moving into position. He can hear them, branches cracking, equipment rattling, voices calling out in Japanese, not even bothering with stealth. They're that confident. Edson has 840 men, Marines, Raiders, Paratroopers, exhausted, hungry, shaking with malaria. Many haven't slept in 36 hours. The math is brutal. They're outnumbered more than 3 to 1. If this ridge falls, Japanese artillery will rain down on Henderson Field. The aircraft keeping 12,000 Marines alive will be destroyed. Everyone on this island, cut off, surrounded, annihilated. Everything depends on holding one strip of coral and kunai grass for one more night. Edson doesn't give his men a speech about glory. He gives them the truth. Hold one more night. Just one more night. If we hold, we'll be relieved in the morning. Then, out of the darkness, the Japanese come. What happens over the next 12 hours will shatter Japan's most dangerous assumption about American fighting spirit. It will mark the moment the myth of Japanese invincibility begins to die. And it will answer a question that's haunted military strategists since Pearl Harbor. Can American troops actually fight? This is the story of the night Japan learned to fear. To understand why this single night mattered so much, you need to understand what the world looked like in the summer of 1942. Japan wasn't just winning, they were dominating. In the 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy had swept across the Pacific with speed that stunned military observers worldwide. Hong Kong fell in 17 days. Singapore, the impregnable fortress, surrendered in 70 days. 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops marched into captivity, the largest surrender in British military history. Dutch East Indies collapsed in 3 months. Burma, the Philippines, Wake Island. Everywhere, American and Allied forces had been beaten. Japan now controlled territory spanning 5,000 miles, from the borders of India to the islands of the Central Pacific. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina. The Greater East Asia. Co-prosperity sphere was becoming reality. But more valuable than territory, Japanese commanders had won something else: belief. They had convinced themselves that Western soldiers simply could not fight. This wasn't propaganda. Japanese officers genuinely believed it. They'd watched British troops surrender by the tens of thousands at Singapore, many without firing a shot. They'd seen American forces on Bataan hold out bravely, but ultimately collapse after months of starvation. They'd studied their own victories in China, where Japanese soldiers won again and again through shock, speed, and willingness to die. The conclusion seemed obvious. Asian soldiers possessed a spiritual strength that Westerners lacked. The Bushido Code, the warrior tradition stretching back centuries, gave Japanese troops an edge that no amount of American industrial production could overcome. 1 Japanese soldier was worth 10 Americans. This was accepted as fact by officers who would stake thousands of lives on that assumption. Japanese military intelligence reinforced this fantasy. American Marines were described as prison inmates given the choice between combat and incarceration, undisciplined, poorly trained, likely to break under pressure. The few thousand Marines on Guadalcanal, estimated at 2,000 men, maybe less, poorly supplied, demoralized, ripe for destruction. Imperial headquarters in Tokyo operated on these assumptions when planning the recapture of Guadalcanal. They allocated forces adequate for the weak garrison they imagined. They never considered that reality might be different. This assessment was wrong in almost every particular. And one man understood exactly how wrong it was. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, had no illusions about his situation. His Marines had landed on August 7th with 17 days of ammunition and food. The Navy pulled out after heavy losses at the Battle of Savo Island, leaving Vandegrift's force isolated on an island they barely controlled. Japanese aircraft bombed Henderson Field daily, flying from Rabaul in formations that seemed endless. Japanese warships shelled the perimeter nightly, 14-inch shells turning darkness into fire and thunder. Japanese reinforcements poured onto the island via high-speed destroyer runs the Americans called the Tokyo Express. Vandegrift's men were hungry, sick, surrounded by an enemy growing stronger every week while their supplies dwindled. By any rational military assessment, the situation was desperate. But Vandegrift knew something the Japanese didn't. He knew what Marines were actually capable of. These weren't convicts or conscripts. Marine recruit training lasted 13 weeks, longer than any other American service. Every Marine received 147 hours of rifle instruction at Parris Island, nearly triple what Army soldiers received. Every Marine qualified as a rifleman before learning any other specialty. This wasn't rhetoric. This was doctrine, established after the Commandant discovered in 1899 that fewer than 100 Marines in the entire Corps could meet marksmanship standards. The Corps had spent 4 decades taking shooting seriously. By 1942, Marine marksmanship was legendary. Qualification standards that would mark an Army soldier as expert barely met minimum requirements for Marines. More importantly, Marines had developed something unique in military organization. Since 1934, they'd trained specifically for amphibious assault, the most difficult military operation in existence. They'd written the book on it, literally. The tentative manual for landing operations, published that year, became the foundation for amphibious doctrine, not just in America, but worldwide. The Navy adopted it, the Army adopted it, even the British used it. Between 1935 and 1941, Marines conducted 7 fleet landing exercises, working out doctrine for naval gunfire support, close air support, and infantry tactics against fortified beaches. They developed landing craft requirements. They trained naval officers to coordinate bombardment with infantry movements. They learned through painful trial and error what worked and what got men killed. No other military in the world had invested this kind of effort into storming defended shorelines. The Japanese were about to discover what that training produced. The first test came on August 21st, 2 weeks before Edson's Ridge. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki led 917 elite Japanese soldiers across a sandbar at the mouth of the Ilu River. These were veterans of the China campaigns, hardened troops who'd never known defeat. Ichiki was a decorated officer with years of combat experience. His regiment had participated in the conquest of Guam. They expected to sweep through American lines in a single night. They attacked at night, screaming, bayonets fixed, absolutely certain they would shatter the Marines as they'd shattered every other enemy they'd faced. The Marines were waiting. They'd dug in along the west bank. Machine guns covered the sandbar from multiple positions. Riflemen had registered their weapons on likely crossing points during daylight. Barbed wire stretched across approaches. The position wasn't elaborate, but it was prepared. When Ichiki's men charged across the sandbar in darkness, machine guns opened up from 3 directions. Tracers cut through packed formations. Riflemen fired with accuracy that hundreds of hours on the range had built into muscle memory. The Japanese charge slammed into a wall of fire and disintegrated. Wave after wave came forward. Wave after wave was destroyed. Bodies piled on the sandbar until Japanese soldiers had to climb over their own dead. By dawn, the carnage was total. M3 Stuart light tanks from the 1st Tank Battalion rolled through the coconut grove where survivors had retreated, completing the destruction. Marines counted more than 800 dead Japanese soldiers. Colonel Ichiki burned his regimental colors to prevent their capture, then shot himself. American losses, 35 killed. When reports reached Tokyo, staff officers refused to believe them. The numbers had to be wrong. Japanese soldiers didn't die in those ratios. It wasn't possible. But it was possible. And it was about to happen again. The defeat at the Tenaru was attributed to Ichiki's overconfidence. He divided his force, attacking with only half his regiment. Tokyo reasoned that a stronger force, properly coordinated, would succeed where Ichiki failed. Major General Kawaguchi brought 3,000 men through the jungle to attack from the south, avoiding coastal areas where Ichiki had been destroyed. His route took weeks to traverse, soldiers hacking through vegetation so dense that progress sometimes slowed to hundreds of yards per day. Many collapsed from exhaustion and disease before reaching assault positions. His plan was sound. His troops were fresh compared to the Marines. And he'd chosen his target, the ridge where Lieutenant Colonel Edson waited with 840 raiders. Edson understood what was coming. Intelligence had detected Japanese movements. Coast watchers reported the Tokyo Express delivering reinforcements. The ridge 1 mile south of Henderson Field was the obvious approach for any force attempting to reach the airfield through jungle. Edson positioned his men carefully. 1st Raider Battalion and 1st Parachute Battalion spread across roughly 1,000 yards. They dug fighting holes in rocky coral soil. They cleared fields of fire through kunai grass. They registered artillery coordinates on likely approach routes. And they waited. September 12th, 9:30 p.m. The assault began with a Japanese cruiser and 3 destroyers shelling Marine positions. Shells crashed into the ridge, sending coral fragments spinning through darkness. As the bombardment lifted, the first waves emerged from the jungle. What followed was 12 hours of combat so intense that veterans struggled to describe it for the rest of their lives. The Japanese attacked in waves, hurling themselves at Marine lines through waist-high kunai grass. Officers led with drawn swords, screaming commands. Enlisted men followed with bayonets fixed, some firing as they ran, others saving bullets for close quarters. Grenades arced through darkness, their explosions punctuating the continuous roar of rifle fire. Machine guns fired until barrels glowed red. Gunners poured water on mechanisms to keep them functioning. Marines fought with bayonets when ammunition ran low, with knives when bayonets broke, with entrenching tools in bare hands when nothing else remained. The fighting was so close, men could smell their enemies, so dark that friend and foe were distinguished only by shape and sound. The center of the Marine line buckled. A company of paratroopers was nearly overrun, its commander killed, survivors falling back in confusion. Japanese soldiers penetrated to within 1,000 yards of Henderson Field. Some reached the edge of the airstrip itself before being killed. Edson was everywhere. Standing on an ammunition box in full view of the enemy, silhouetted against artillery flashes, he directed fire, repositioned units, rallied men close to breaking. His nickname was Red Mike, earned from a beard he'd worn in Nicaragua. That night, he earned something more valuable, the Medal of Honor. At one point, with the line collapsing and Japanese forces pouring through the gap, Edson encountered Marines falling back in disorder. "Where are you going?" he demanded. "We can't hold them," came the reply. Edson's response became legend. "By God, you will hold. Now get back there and do it." They held. By 3 shatter a.m. on September 14th, the crisis peaked. Japanese forces had punched through the center, pouring toward the airfield. Edson had committed every reserve. There was nothing left. Major General Vandegrift, waiting at his command post, later admitted it was the only time during the entire Guadalcanal campaign he doubted the outcome. Then, artillery arrived. The 11th Marines had registered their guns on the ridge during daylight. Now, in darkness, they fired mission after mission onto Japanese assault columns. 105mm shells tore through packed formations with devastating effect. Shrapnel scythed through men advancing shoulder to shoulder. Blast waves threw bodies through the air. The jungle erupted in continuous explosions that turned approach routes into killing grounds. The Japanese advance stalled, then fragmented, then broke entirely. Dawn revealed the scale of victory. More than 600 Japanese bodies lay on the ridge and in the jungle below. Some counts reached 800. Wounded Japanese soldiers had been dragged back into jungle by comrades, meaning the actual toll was probably higher. Marine casualties, under 200 with fewer than 60 killed. Kawaguchi retreated into the jungle with remnants of his brigade. Many would die of starvation and disease in weeks ahead, unable to be resupplied or evacuated. He started with 3,000 men. He would emerge months later with a fraction of that number. The Battle of Edson's Ridge, later called Bloody Ridge, was over. One word spread through both armies after that night. Among the Marines, it was simple. They had held. Against 3-to-1 odds, in darkness, with everything at stake. They had held. It was exactly what their training had prepared them to do. Among the Japanese, the word was different. It was confusion. It was doubt. For the first time, Japanese soldiers had thrown themselves against an American position with everything they had, and they'd been slaughtered. Second Lieutenant Genjiro Inui, an officer with the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company, recorded his thoughts in a diary that would survive the war. He'd witnessed the aftermath of both the Tenaru and Edson's Ridge. Their firepower had overwhelmed us, he wrote. We had put too much confidence in our charging power. Only after our superior firepower can compete with their superior firepower will the charging power of the Imperial Army win a victory. This wasn't propaganda for home consumption. This was a professional soldier's private assessment, never intended to be read by anyone but himself. And it captured something profound. The Japanese were beginning to understand that their assumptions about American infantry were catastrophically wrong. Inui noted another revelation, one that challenged everything Tokyo believed. Based on the wishful thinking by the Imperial headquarters that the United States Marine Corps were about 2,000 or so, Ichiki's force was divided up and dispatched to Guadalcanal with small arms. The reality: 12,000 Marines held the island. Japanese intelligence had been wrong by a factor of 6, but understanding came slowly. Tokyo wasn't ready to accept that its soldiers were being outfought by men they'd dismissed as soft and undisciplined. More troops were sent, more attacks ordered, more bodies piled up on Guadalcanal. October 1942. The battle for Henderson Field brought 20,000 Japanese soldiers against the Marine perimeter in the largest ground assault of the campaign. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake personally directed the operation. Japanese battleships bombarded the airfield with 14-inch shells on the nights of October 13th and 14th, destroying half of Marine aviation fuel and dozens of aircraft. Japanese soldiers attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, an operation far more sophisticated than anything previously attempted. The Marines held again. Over 3 days of combat, the Japanese suffered approximately 3,500 dead. American losses, under 300. The pattern established at the Tenaru and Edson's Ridge was repeating itself across the entire perimeter. Japanese attacks were being shattered against Marine firepower with kill ratios that defied everything Tokyo believed about infantry combat. By February 1943, the Japanese evacuated Guadalcanal. They'd landed approximately 36,000 troops. Over 6 months of desperate fighting, they'd lost between 20,000 and 30,000 killed, with thousands more dead from disease and starvation. Marine and Army ground forces together lost around 1,600 killed in action. The myth of Japanese military invincibility died on Guadalcanal. It died on the sandbar at the Tenaru. It died on Edson's Ridge. It died in the mud and jungle around Henderson Field, and Japanese commanders knew it. What Tokyo understood, and what took the rest of the world longer to grasp, was that Guadalcanal wasn't a fluke. The Marines had developed a way of fighting that the Japanese couldn't match. It combined rifle marksmanship, small unit tactics, and devastating supporting fires into a system that chewed through banzai charges like a meat grinder. The key innovation was the fire team structure Marines had developed in the years before the war. By January 1944, Marine infantry squads consisted of 13 men organized into 3 fire teams of 4 men each. Each fire team contained a leader, an automatic rifleman carrying the Browning automatic rifle, an assistant automatic rifleman, a rifleman. This meant 3 automatic weapons per squad. Army squads of the same period carried only 1 bar. Marines could generate 3 times the automatic weapons fire at the squad level, the basic building block of infantry combat. The difference mattered. In close-range fighting that characterized Pacific Island combat, concentrated automatic fire was decisive. A Marine squad could suppress an enemy position while maneuvering against it, using 1 fire team to pin the enemy and 2 to attack from different angles. This flexibility had been designed for amphibious assault, where units often landed fragmented and had to operate independently. It proved equally valuable in jungle warfare, where larger formations couldn't maintain cohesion. The war in the Pacific had changed. The question was whether Japan could adapt. The answer came over the next 3 years, written in blood across islands whose names would become synonymous with Marine sacrifice: Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. At Tarawa in November 1943, the 2nd Marine Division assaulted Bedio Island, a fortress of concrete bunkers defended by nearly 5,000 elite Japanese naval infantry. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki boasted that 1,000,000 men couldn't take Tarawa in 100 years. The Marines took it in 76 hours. The cost was appalling. Nearly 1,000 Marines died, many wading hundreds of yards through chest-deep water under machine gun fire because their landing craft couldn't clear the coral reef. More than 2,000 were wounded, but when it was over, only 17 Japanese soldiers from the original garrison survived to surrender. That meant 4,500 Japanese had been killed in 3 days on an island smaller than Central Park. Shibasaki himself died on the 2nd day, killed by naval gunfire. His prediction about 1,000,000 men in 100 years, proven wrong by 18,000 Marines and 76 hours. At Peleliu in September 1944, the Japanese unveiled a new defensive doctrine that would make Guadalcanal's banzai charges seem almost merciful. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa commanded roughly 11,000 defenders. Rather than waste men in frontal assaults, Nakagawa placed only a single battalion on the beaches. His main strength hid in more than 500 caves carved into the Umerbrogel ridges, which Marines would call Bloody Nose Ridge. Major General William Rupertus predicted a rough but fast battle lasting perhaps 4 days. It lasted 73 days. The 1st Marine Regiment suffered such catastrophic casualties, it was rendered combat ineffective. Some rifle companies lost over 60% of their men in the first week. The tactics that worked at Guadalcanal and Tarawa, suppressing enemy positions then destroying them, failed against defenders who refused to show themselves until Marines were within grenade range. Nakagawa held out until November. His final message, "Our sword is broken and we have run out of spears." Then he burned his regimental colors and committed ritual suicide. American casualties at Peleliu exceeded 8,000, including more than 500 killed. Japanese losses approached 11,000 with only a handful surviving. The lessons of Peleliu spread through both militaries. The Japanese had found a way to multiply the effectiveness of their defenders. The Marines had found that their existing tactics were no longer sufficient. Both would apply what they learned to the battles still to come. By 1944, Japanese military doctrine was undergoing a fundamental shift. The lesson of Guadalcanal, confirmed at Tarawa, could no longer be ignored. American Marines were not soft. They were not undisciplined. They were not going to break under pressure. Banzai charges, the massed infantry assaults that had worked in China and across Southeast Asia, were simply feeding men into a killing machine. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was perhaps the first Japanese commander to fully absorb this lesson and act on it. Assigned to defend Iwo Jima in June 1944, Kuribayashi brought unusual qualifications. He'd spent time in the United States from 1928 to 1930, traveling extensively. He'd visited Detroit and observed American industrial capacity. He'd studied American military thinking. He understood his enemy in a way few Japanese officers did. More importantly, Kuribayashi had studied Tarawa with professional intensity. He knew that believing American infantry had no stomach for close combat was, in his own words, foolhardy. The Marines had overwhelmed a heavily fortified force in 3 days. They'd waded through fire that should have stopped them cold. They'd taken casualties that should have broken them, and kept attacking anyway. Kuribayashi concluded that everything about Japanese defensive doctrine needed to change. No more beach defenses. Marine naval gunfire and air support made coastal fortifications death traps. Positions on beaches would be destroyed before the enemy even landed. Defenders would pull back inland into caves and tunnels where American firepower couldn't reach them. No more banzai charges. Every soldier who died in a pointless frontal assault was one less soldier to kill Marines tomorrow. The goal wasn't glory. It was making the Americans pay the highest possible price for every yard of ground. On Iwo Jima, Kuribayashi's tactics resulted in the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history. Over 36 days of fighting, nearly 7,000 Marines were killed and 20,000 wounded out of an assault force of 70,000. But the Japanese had learned their lesson too late. The outcome was never in doubt, only the cost. Of the 21 Japanese defenders, fewer than 300 survived to become prisoners. The transformation that began on Guadalcanal, the realization that American Marines could not be broken by spiritual fervor or warrior tradition, had taken 3 years to fully sink in. 3 years. Dozens of islands, hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides. And it all started on that ridge, on that night, when 840 exhausted Marines held against 3,000 Japanese soldiers and shattered a myth that Tokyo had built its entire Pacific strategy upon. Merritt Edson survived the war. He retired as a Major General in 1947 and died in 1955. His Medal of Honor citation reads in part, "By his astute leadership and gallant devotion to duty, he enabled his men, despite severe losses, to cling tenaciously to their position and repulse every assault." But the real citation should have read differently. It should have said, "On the night of September 12, 1942, this officer taught the Imperial Japanese Army that American Marines would not break, that American firepower would overwhelm spiritual fervor, that the age of infantry charges against prepared positions was over." The lesson cost Japan dearly. It would cost them again at Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. But the learning began on Edson's Ridge, in the darkness, in the kunai grass, when 840 men held because they'd been trained to hold, because they had the weapons to hold, because they had the doctrine to hold, and because one man stood on an ammunition box in full view of the enemy and told them the truth, "By God, you will hold." They did. That night, Japan learned to fear. If this story of courage and transformation moved you, hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten battles with more people who need to hear them. Subscribe to WWII Ember for more untold stories from the Pacific War. Drop a comment below and tell us, where are you watching from? Are you a veteran, a history student, or just someone who believes these sacrifices should never be forgotten? Our community spans the globe. You're part of keeping this history alive. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. World War II. Ember, where history burns bright.